Deep within the shadows of the night, a monster lurks with eyes so bright. It slithers through the darkness in between the trees, bringing with it a dreadful feeling of unease. Its body twisted, long and lean. Its skin the color of the darkest dream. Sharp teeth glinting in the moonlight. A creature born of the deepest fright. Its breath is hot and smells of death. As it moves with an unsettling stealth, it searches for prey with a primal thirst. In the dead of night, it is at its worst. Beneath the moon's eerie glow, it stalks its prey, moving slow. The rustling leaves, a harbinger of doom, as the monster prepares to strike, consumed by gloom. Its claws extend with a sickening crack, as it lunges forward, ready to attack. Its prey is frozen in terror and dread. The monster sinks its teeth into victim's head. The sound of crunching bone fills the air. The monster feasts without a care. Blood drips from its jaws staining the ground. It revels in the hunt, lost and unbound. For the monster is a creature of the night, a being born of darkness, full of fright. And though we may try to hide away, it will find us, no matter what we say. So beware the monster, lurking in the dark. For it will strike, leaving its mark. A symbol of terror, a sign of dread. A creature sown by the devil's thread. The monster's name is whispered with fear, known to all as the beast of despair. Born in a world of eternal night, a place where darkness never sees light. Its origins are shrouded in mystery, a creature of legend, full of history. Some say it was born from a curse, a punishment for sins too perverse. Others say it was a creation of fear, brought to life by nightmares unclear. Whatever the truth may be, the monster roams, wild and free. It feeds on the souls of the lost, those who wander, at any cost, into the depths of its domain, where its power will forever reign. The monster's eyes gleam with delight, as it sees its prey in its sight. The fear in their eyes, a welcome sight, as it prepares to feast on their fright. Its roar echoes through the night, a sound that chills to the bone, with might. The ground shakes beneath its weight, as it pounces on its helpless bait. The beast of despair is a creature of dread, hunting you until you are dead. No one knows how to stop its reign, or if it will ever be slain. So if you ever hear its roar, raise your feet over the floor. For if it catches you in its grasp, your soul will be lost, forever in its clasp.
Hunter and his friends had been planning their summer camping trip for months, and the excitement was palpable as they all met up in the city to begin their journey. They had all known each other since high school, and despite going their separate ways after graduation, they had remained close. Hunter, the ringleader of the group, was the one who had suggested renting a cabin in the woods for the weekend. He was always up for an adventure and loved nothing more than being out in nature. He had a rugged, outdoorsy look about him with his shaggy brown hair, scruffy beard, and muscular build. His friends always looked up to him and trusted his judgment, which was why they all readily agreed to his plan. As they loaded their backpacks and camping gear into Hunter's truck, the group couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation for the weekend ahead. They joked and laughed as they made their way out of the city, the urban landscape giving way to the lush greenery of the forest. Hunter and his friends made their way further up the mountain and deeper into the forest. They decided to make a quick stop at a country store to pick up some supplies. The store was small and quaint, with shelves stacked high with jars of pickled vegetables, canned goods, and hunting gear. As they walked up to the cash register to pay, an old man with a long white beard and a weathered face greeted them. He wore a plaid shirt and suspenders, and his eyes were sharp as he looked at each of them in turn.
Y'all headed up to the cabin, are ya?
The old man asked. Hunter nodded.
Yeah, we're looking forward to a weekend in the woods.
The old man's eyes darkened as he leaned in closer to them.
You kids should be careful out there.
He warned.
There've been some strange things happening in those woods lately. People disappearing without a trace.
Hunter and his friends exchanged a look and chuckled nervously, assuming the old man was just trying to scare them.
Thanks for the warning, old-timer,
Hunter said with a grin.
We'll keep an eye out for any boogeymen.
The old man shook his head, a serious expression on his face.
It ain't no boogeyman, son. There's something out there. Something that ain't natural.
Hunter and his friends shrugged off the old man's words and headed back out to the truck, excited for the adventure ahead. But as they drove deeper into the forest, Hunter couldn't help but feel a creeping sense of unease. Was the old man's warning just an old wives' tale, or was there really something sinister lurking in the woods? They arrived at the cabin just as the sun reached high noon. They stepped out of the truck, and the fresh scent of pine and earth invigorated them. The cabin was rustic but charming, with a large stone fireplace, wooden beams, and cozy furnishings. Hunter and his friends eagerly explored the cabin, claiming their rooms and making plans for the next day's adventure. Little did they know that the forest held secrets that would turn their fun-filled weekend into a fight for survival. After an afternoon of hiking and exploring the woods, Hunter and his friends returned to the cabin, ravenous and ready to eat. They fired up the grill outside and cooked up a feast of burgers, hot dogs, and grilled vegetables. The smell of sizzling meat and charred onions filled the air, and Hunter's stomach rumbled with hunger. As they ate, the sun began to set, casting a golden light over the forest. Hunter and his friends talked and laughed, reliving the adventures of the day and making plans for tomorrow's hike. But as the sun dipped below the trees, the temperature began to drop, and they decided to head inside. The cabin was cozy and warm, with a crackling fire in the fireplace and soft blankets draped over the couches. The smell of wood smoke mixed with the aroma of the dinner they had just eaten, creating a comforting atmosphere. Hunter settled into one of the armchairs, feeling content and relaxed. As the night wore on, Hunter and his friends played board games and drank beer, enjoying the peaceful solitude of the woods. But as they began to yawn and feel the fatigue of the day, Hunter noticed a strange noise outside. It sounded like rustling leaves, but there was something about it that seemed off.
Did you guys hear that?
Hunter asked, turning to his friends. They all paused, listening. Sure enough, there was a faint rustling sound coming from outside. Hunter got up and walked to the window, peering out into the darkness. But all he could see was the thick blackness of the forest, the trees rustling in the wind. He shook his head, chiding himself for being paranoid, and turned back to his friends.
Must have just been a branch or something,
he said with a shrug.
Let's get some sleep. We've got a big day tomorrow.
The group settled into the living room, gathering around a crackling fire in the stone fireplace to tell some ghost stories before bed. But only one story in, Hunter's girlfriend Samantha suddenly straightened and declared she thought she left her phone outside. She leapt out of his arms and had darted to the back door before anyone could say a word. Samantha darted out the back door. Almost immediately after the screen swung shut behind her, Hunter and the others heard a low growl followed by a thunderous roar. Hunter's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the sound. He grabbed his gun and bolted after Samantha, shouting for the others to follow. Outside, Samantha had found her phone on the table and was reaching for it when the bear appeared, towering over her on its hind legs. Its eyes glinted in the dim light, and its breath was hot and fetid. Samantha froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The others emerged from the cabin just in time to see the bear swat at Samantha with a massive paw, sending her tumbling to the ground. Tyler took aim with his rifle and fired, the sound echoing through the woods. The bear staggered, but did not fall. It turned its attention to the group, its massive form seeming to fill the entire clearing. Hunter and the others backed away, their hearts racing. They knew they were no match for the beast, but they couldn't leave Samantha behind. The bear let out a guttural roar and charged, its massive frame hurtling towards them. The group scattered, dodging trees and leaping over rocks as they tried to evade the beast. Hunter fired his gun, but the bear seemed unfazed. Just then, another bullet exploded from somewhere out in the blackness of the forest. The bear reared back and then fell, crashing to the ground and rising plumes of dust around it. Samantha jumped back into Hunter's arms, sobbing. Hunter had dropped his rifle to hold his girlfriend when a hunter emerged from the woods, shotgun in hand. The man had a stern look on his face as he approached the group, who were gathered around the still body of the massive bear. The hunter's eyes flicked over the group, his gaze stopping on Hunter's gun.
You kids should know better than to come into these woods without respect,
he growled, gesturing to the dead bear.
That there was a mighty fine specimen. It's a shame to have to put it down because y'all were being careless.
Hunter stepped forward, trying to explain that they had been caught off guard by the bear, but the old man cut him off.
I don't want to hear your excuses, boy,
he said gruffly.
You should know better than to come into these woods without being prepared for anything.
The man then proceeded to describe how he had taken down the bear with a single shot to the head. He explained that he had been tracking the beast for days and that it had been terrorizing the area for some time. The group watched in awe as the hunter expertly skinned and dressed the bear, taking only what he needed and leaving the rest for the forest creatures. After he was finished, the hunter turned to the group, his expression softening slightly.
You kids are lucky to be alive,
he said, looking each of them in the eye.
You need to respect the wilderness and be prepared for anything. This ain't no game, and it ain't no playground.
Hunter and his friends nodded, feeling chastened and a little embarrassed by their recklessness. They thanked the hunter for his help and advice, and the man disappeared back into the woods, leaving the group alone with the remains of the bear and a newfound respect for the dangers of the wild. The group rose early the next morning, packing up their belongings in silence. Samantha's injury dampened their spirits, and the recent events left them feeling uneasy. They piled into their cars and made their way back down the winding roads towards civilization. They made a quick stop at the country store to fill up on gas before hitting the main highway. As they pulled into the gas station, they saw the old hunter man inside the store, deep in conversation with the same old man who had warned them about the dangers of the woods. The man's gaze fell upon them as they entered the store, and Hunter could feel his eyes drilling into him with contempt. The old man finished his conversation with the hunter and turned to face the group.
I reckon that bear would still be alive if you all had listened to someone smarter than yourselves.
He muttered, his tone heavy with disapproval. Hunter and his friends exchanged nervous glances, feeling chastised by the old man's words. They quickly finished their business at the store and left, the memory of the bear and the old man's warning lingering in their minds long after they had left the woods behind. As they drove away, Hunter couldn't shake the feeling that they had narrowly escaped something much more sinister than a wild animal. The memory of the old man's warning echoed in his mind, a haunting reminder that the woods held secrets that were best left undisturbed.
In the heart of London, nestled among the old cobblestone streets and towering buildings, stood a grand old mansion, draped in ivy and surrounded by a sprawling garden. It was a place of legend and superstition, for the locals whispered that it was haunted by the ghost of a woman named Rosella. Rosella was said to have lived there in the Victorian era, a beautiful young woman with long, flowing hair and a penchant for wearing elegant dresses. But her life was not a happy one, for her husband had died young, leaving her alone and bereft. In her grief, Rosella had taken to drinking, and it was said that she had poisoned herself with a lethal dose of arsenic, unable to bear the loneliness any longer. It was a dark and stormy night when Rosella took her last breath. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and sending shivers down her spine. She sat alone in the dimly lit sitting room, staring out into the darkness and mourning the loss of her beloved husband. As the hours wore on, her grief turned to desperation, and she reached for the bottle of arsenic that she had hidden away. She knew that it was a deadly poison, but in her despair, she no longer cared. She mixed the poison with water and brought the glass to her lips, closing her eyes as she drank. At first, there was nothing. But then, a searing pain ripped through her body, and she fell to the ground, writhing in agony. Her vision grew blurry, and she could hear the sound of her own labored breathing. She knew that death was coming for her, but even in her final moments, she could not bear to be alone. With a last burst of energy, she stumbled to her feet and stumbled through the darkened hallways, searching for someone, anyone who could keep her company in her final moments. But the mansion was empty, and no one came to her aid. And so, Rosella died alone, her body racked with pain, her soul consumed by loneliness. Her ghostly form lingered in the mansion, doomed to haunt the halls for all eternity, a reminder of the tragic fate that had befallen her. But even in death, Rosella could not bear to be alone. She haunted the halls of the mansion, her ghostly form flitting from room to room, searching for companionship. And as the years passed, her loneliness grew, until she hatched a dark and sinister plan. Rosella had always been a masterful cook, and she knew just how to blend the sweetest flavors and the most fragrant aromas. And so, she began to brew a potent poison, a potion that would lure the living into her grasp. She would wait for unsuspecting travelers to pass by the mansion, then she would offer them a drink, tempting them with the promise of a delicious and refreshing concoction. But once they had taken a sip, it was too late. The poison would work its deadly magic, and the victim would fall into a deep sleep from which they would never wake. And then, Rosella would have a companion, a soul to keep her company in her eternal loneliness. One night, a young couple came wandering through the streets of London, lost and confused. Porter and Lucy had been wandering the streets of London for hours, hopelessly lost and searching for a place to rest. The night was cold and dark, and they were growing weary. Just as they were about to give up hope, they saw a faint light in the distance, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. As they drew closer, they saw that the light was coming from a grand old mansion, draped in ivy and surrounded by a sprawling garden. It looked abandoned, but there was a strange allure to it, a sense of mystery and intrigue that drew them closer. As they approached the mansion, they saw a figure standing in the doorway, a woman dressed in a flowing gown, her long hair blowing in the wind. It was Rosella, the ghostly woman who haunted the halls.
Welcome, travelers.
She said, her voice soft and seductive.
Please, come inside and warm yourselves by the fire. I have a drink that will refresh you after your long journey.
Porter and Lucy were hesitant at first, but there was something about Rosella's gentle smile that put them at ease. They stepped inside the mansion, the door creaking as it closed behind them. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of old books and damp stone. But there was a fire crackling in the fireplace, casting a warm glow over the room. Rosella gestured for them to sit, and they did so, eager for a respite from the cold. She brought them a tray of glasses filled with a sweet, fragrant liquid.
Please, drink.
She said, smiling once more.
It will refresh you, I promise.
They took a sip, and at first, it was delicious, the taste of honey and elderflower dancing on their tongues. But as they drank more, they began to feel a strange and sudden drowsiness, a heaviness that dragged at their limbs. Rosella watched them closely, her eyes bright with anticipation. But as the couple began to nod off, a sudden gust of wind swept through the mansion, blowing out the candles and plunging the room into darkness. In the blackness, they could hear Rosella's ghostly laughter, taunting them and urging them to drink more. But they were not so easily fooled. They stumbled to their feet and ran from the mansion, their hearts pounding in their chests. For Porter and Lucy, it was a narrow escape. But for Rosella, it was just another night of loneliness, her heart heavy with the knowledge that no one would ever stay with her for long. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, as Rosella continued to haunt the halls of the mansion, her loneliness weighing heavily upon her. But then, one sunny afternoon, she heard a sound that filled her heart with hope. It was the sound of a child's laughter, echoing through the overgrown garden of the yard. Rosella made her way outside, her ghostly form drifting through the overgrown grass and weeds. And there, in the midst of it all, was a young girl, no more than 6 or 7 years old, twirling in the sunlight and giggling with delight. Rosella was overjoyed at the sight of the child, her heart swelling with the possibility of having a daughter to keep her company. She approached the girl, her ghostly hand reaching out to touch her shoulder.
Hello, little one.
She said softly.
What's your name?
The girl looked up at her with wide, curious eyes.
My name is Alice.
She said.
Who are you?
Rosella smiled, a gentle warmth spreading through her spectral form.
My name is Rosella.
She said.
And I live in this big, old mansion. Would you like to come inside and play with me?
Alice nodded eagerly, her eyes shining with excitement. Rosella led her inside the mansion, her heart racing with anticipation. Once inside, Rosella showed Alice to a room filled with toys and games, promising her all the fun and adventure that a child could ever want. Alice was delighted, and for a while, it seemed as though Rosella had found the companion she had always longed for. But as the hours wore on, Rosella began to grow anxious, knowing that she could not keep the child forever. She tried to convince Alice to stay, offering her sweets and toys and promising her a lifetime of happiness. But the child, sensing something was amiss, grew fearful and began to cry. It was then that Rosella realized her mistake. She could never force someone to stay with her, not through trickery or deceit. With a heavy heart, she led Alice back outside, knowing that she would never see the child again. As Alice ran off into the sunlight, Rosella stood alone in the garden, her ghostly form racked with sobs. She had once again been reminded of the harsh truth that haunted her for all eternity, that her loneliness was a curse that could never be broken. And so, the legend of Rosella lived on, a tale of ghostly loneliness and deadly temptation. To this day, the locals still speak of her, warning travelers to steer clear of the haunted mansion and the ghostly woman who dwells within. For Rosella may be beautiful and charming, but her heart is as cold and dark as the poison she brews.
Edward was a striking figure, with his pale complexion, jet black hair, and piercing blue eyes that seemed to look straight through a person. His most distinctive feature, however, were his hands, which were not hands at all, but rather long, sharp blades that glinted in the light. Despite his fearsome appearance, there was a certain vulnerability about him. He seemed almost childlike in his naivety and innocence, as if he had been sheltered from the world his entire life. His movements were hesitant and uncertain, as if he was afraid he might hurt someone with his deadly appendages. Yet there was also a certain grace to his movements. He moved with a fluidity that was almost otherworldly, as if he was dancing to a rhythm that only he could hear. And when he wielded his scissor hands, he did so with a precision and skill that was almost beautiful to watch. To those who took the time to get to know him, Edward was a gentle soul, with a heart full of love and compassion. He had a childlike wonder about him, and a sense of innocence that was almost contagious. But to those who didn't understand him, he was a monster, a freak of nature to be feared and avoided at all costs. Despite the many challenges he faced, Edward never lost his sense of wonder and curiosity. He continued to explore the world around him, always looking for new ways to create and express himself. And even when the world seemed against him, he never gave up hope that someday he might find a place where he truly belonged. Edward Scissorhands had always been an outsider, never quite fitting in with the rest of the community. Despite his kind heart and gentle nature, his Scissorhands made him an object of fear and suspicion to those around him. It was a dark and stormy night when Edward's world came crashing down. He had been out wandering in the woods, lost in thought, when he stumbled upon a group of young teens who were up to no good. They had been drinking and smoking, and when they saw Edward, they decided to have some fun at his expense. At first, they taunted him, calling him names and making fun of his strange appearance. But then, things took a turn for the worse. One of the teens grabbed hold of Edward's arm, causing him to instinctively lash out with his scissor hands. The boy stumbled back, blood pouring from his wounds, and the others erupted into a frenzy. Word of the attack spread quickly through the small town, and soon, a mob of angry townspeople had gathered outside the Boggs family home, where Edward had been staying. They banged on the doors and windows, shouting for Edward to be turned over to them. As the night wore on, the crowd grew more and more frenzied, fueled by rumors and hearsay. Some claimed that Edward was a dangerous lunatic who had come to the town to wreak havoc. Others fell into a league with the neighbor Esmeralda, the odd mousy woman who was never seen without a big clunky Bible. Esmeralda had said all along that he was a demon, sent from hell to punish them for their sins. And now others were beginning to think the strange woman was right. The Boggs family, who had taken Edward in and cared for him, knew they had to act fast. They helped him escape the angry mob and brought him safely back up to his castle on the mountain. But things were not as they seemed. The Boggs family had been staunch defenders of Edward, even in the face of overwhelming opposition from the rest of the town. They had taken him in and given him a place to stay, showing him kindness and compassion when no one else would. But something changed when Edward took them up to the castle on the mountain. At first, everything seemed to be going well. The family marveled at the strange, Gothic architecture of the place, and Edward showed them his various creations, from the intricate ice sculptures to the topiary gardens. But then, things started to take a dark turn. As they explored the castle, the family began to notice strange and unsettling things. They stumbled upon a room filled with bizarre contraptions, each more macabre than the last. And then, they found the room with the preserved body parts, each one carefully labeled and catalogued. The Boggs family was horrified, and they demanded an explanation from Edward. But he was unable to give them one, simply staring at them with his piercing black eyes, his scissor hands at the ready. As the tension mounted, the family began to feel increasingly uneasy. They realized that they were in way over their heads, and that they had no idea what kind of person Edward really was. It was then that they made the fateful decision to turn on him, accusing him of being a monster and a danger to society. Edward was stunned by their sudden change of heart, and he tried to plead with them, to explain that he had never meant to harm anyone. But it was too late. The Boggs family had made up their minds, and they were determined to see Edward punished for his supposed crimes. Peg Boggs and her husband Jim ran screaming from the crumbling, decaying castle, followed by their children Kevin and Kim. The family was too frightened to even stop for their car, instead running at full sprint down the hill. The angry people of the town were still gathered at the foot of the hill. Upon hearing the cries of the Boggs family, the sheriff jumped into his cruiser and raced up the hill with his sirens blaring and red and blue lights flashing. Devastated and confused, Edward went quietly. Nonetheless, the sheriff treated him roughly, cruelly throwing him into the cruiser. Edward's dangerous hands sliced into his face and he cried out as wincing gashes opened on his pale cheeks. He was transported at top speed out of town. Tears slipped down his face, burning his wounds, as he watched out the rear windshield, the snarling, insane faces of the torch-wielding townspeople who had been his friends only hours before. The cruiser raced on into the night, further and further into the middle of nowhere until finally it turned off onto an all but hidden road. They climbed another hill, shrouded in trees and shadows cast by the eerie full moon high overhead. Finally, they emerged into a tangled clearing in front of a sprawling asylum. Lightning struck as the asylum came into view, illuminating the awful place in a terrible eye-squinting light for just one terrible second. And then thunder rumbled evilly. Edward was led down a long, narrow hallway, his scissor hands clinking ominously against the walls. The asylum was a bleak and forbidding place, with peeling paint and flickering fluorescent lights. The air was thick with the smell of disinfectant, and the sound of distant screams echoed through the corridors. The workers who accompanied Edward were cold and aloof, their faces set in hard lines of disapproval. They prodded him with sharp sticks, forcing him to move faster, despite the obvious discomfort caused by his scissor hands. Edward felt like an animal being herded to slaughter, and he couldn't help but wonder what kind of horrors awaited him in this place. When they finally reached his cell, Edward was horrified by the conditions. The room was tiny, with barely enough space for the narrow cot that sat against the wall. The mattress was thin and lumpy, and the sheets were stained and threadbare. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows across the room. The workers shoved Edward roughly into the cell, slamming the door shut behind him. He heard the sound of a key turning in the lock, and knew that he was trapped. He sat down on the edge of the cot, his scissor hands clattering against the metal frame. As he sat there, he could hear the sounds of other patients in nearby cells. Some were shouting and raving, while others moaned softly to themselves. The air was thick with despair and desperation, and Edward knew that he had truly fallen into a nightmare. Over the coming days and weeks, Edward would endure terrible conditions and cruel treatment at the hands of the asylum workers. They would beat him, starve him, and subject him to all manner of unspeakable torments. But through it all, Edward began to imagine that someday, somehow, he would find a way to escape this place and seek revenge against those who had wronged him. He'd all but forgotten the love he'd once held for the Boggs family. Esmeralda, the angry neighbor from back in town, was admitted to the asylum a few months after Edward. She had always been an odd woman, prone to religious fervor and mystical visions. But in recent years, her fanaticism had taken a dark turn. She had become convinced that the world was ending, and that only the most pure and righteous would be saved. Esmeralda had spent the last few years in a small cottage on the outskirts of town, preaching to anyone who would listen about the coming apocalypse. Her sermons were filled with fire and brimstone, and she had a fierce intensity that few could match. But as the years wore on, her followers dwindled, and she grew increasingly isolated and paranoid. Eventually, Esmeralda's obsession drove her to madness. She began to hear voices, to see visions of demons and angels battling for the fate of the world. She would spend hours in a trance, speaking in tongues and writing feverishly in a small journal. It was this madness that led to her being admitted to the asylum. She had been found wandering the streets in a state of delirium, screaming about the end of the world and the coming of the Antichrist. When Edward first encountered Esmeralda in the asylum, he was struck by her intensity. She had a wild look in her eyes, and her hair was matted and unkempt. But despite her appearance, there was a sense of power and purpose emanating from her. Over time, Edward and Esmeralda struck up an unlikely friendship. They would spend hours talking, discussing the nature of God and the fate of the world. Esmeralda's visions had taken on a new urgency, and she was convinced that Edward was somehow connected to the events that were unfolding. Edward became increasingly isolated from the rest of the world, consumed by his anger and hatred. He started to see himself as a victim, and his scissor hands as a means to gain power and control. Esmeralda's influence over Edward grew stronger, until he was completely under her spell. She convinced him to escape from the asylum and embark on a rampage of destruction and chaos. Edward was fueled by rage, and Esmeralda was compelled by sheer madness. Edward and Esmeralda waited until the moon had risen high in the sky before making their move. The asylum was eerily quiet, the only sounds the distant hum of machinery and the occasional creak of floorboards. They moved silently, sticking to the shadows and avoiding the bright lights of the security cameras. The guards were on high alert, and any misstep could mean disaster. As they crept down the long, dimly lit hallways, Edward couldn't help but feel a surge of excitement. It had been years since he had felt so alive, so free. Finally, they reached the exit. It was a heavy metal door, with multiple locks and a keypad. But Esmeralda had a trick up her sleeve. She produced a small wire from her pocket and began to pick the locks with practiced ease. Within moments, the door swung open, revealing the inky darkness beyond. Edward and Esmeralda stepped out into the cool night air, breathing in the sweet scent of freedom. They ran, their feet pounding against the pavement. It felt like they were flying, like they were finally breaking free from the chains that had bound them for so long. As they ran, Edward could feel his mind clearing, his thoughts racing with a newfound energy. He wasn't sure where they were going, or what would happen next. But for the first time in years, he felt truly alive. Eventually, they reached the edge of town, their breath coming in ragged gasps. They paused for a moment, looking out over the silent streets. In the distance, they could hear the faint sound of police sirens. Without a word, they took off again, running towards the hills that loomed in the distance. Edward knew that they were heading towards his old home, the Gothic castle on the mountain. As they climbed higher and higher, Edward could feel his excitement building. He wasn't sure what was waiting for them at the top, but he knew that it was going to be something incredible. Something that would change their lives forever. Together, they returned to the nearby town, where Edward's scissor hands became a weapon of terror, cutting through anything and anyone who stood in their way. The people of the town were terrified, and they quickly realized that they had created a monster. But it was too late. Edward Scissorhands had become a force of darkness, consumed by his own rage and hatred. And Esmeralda, his bitter enemy, was the only one who could stop him. As the town was plunged into chaos, Esmeralda realized that she had created a monster. She had manipulated Edward into embracing his dark side, and now there was no turning back. But even as Edward rampaged through the town, cutting down everything in his path, a part of him still clung to his humanity. He struggled with the knowledge that he was hurting innocent people, but he couldn't seem to stop himself. Esmeralda, on the other hand, reveled in the destruction. She had always been an outcast, and now she finally had the power and control she had always craved. She goaded Edward on, urging him to cause even more destruction. As the night wore on, the chaos grew worse. The streets were filled with the sounds of screaming and the smell of blood. But even in the midst of the carnage, there were those who were determined to stop Edward. The Boggs family, who had turned on Edward and betrayed him, now realized the error of their ways. They joined forces with the police and the townspeople, determined to put an end to Edward's rampage. The battle was long and fierce, with Edward cutting down anyone who stood in his way. But eventually, the Boggs family was able to get close enough to him to reason with him. They reminded him of who he truly was and how much they had cared for him. Gradually, Edward began to remember the kindness that the Boggs family had shown him. He realized that he didn't want to hurt anyone anymore, and he turned on Esmeralda, his bitter enemy. In the final showdown, Edward faced off against Esmeralda, wielding his scissor hands with deadly accuracy. She was a formidable opponent, but in the end, Edward emerged victorious. As the sun began to rise over the town, Edward looked out at the destruction he had caused. He knew that he could never go back to the way things were before, but he also knew that he had the power to make a difference. With the help of the Boggs family, he began to use his scissor hands for good. He worked to rebuild the town and to make amends for the harm he had caused. And even though he would always be an outsider, he finally found a sense of belonging and purpose. The town accepted Edward once again, but he would never know that it was only out of fear of Dark Edward Scissorhands.
Napoleon Dynamite had always been an outcast. He never quite fit in with the other kids at school, and his family life was just as strange. His older brother Kip spent all day chatting up girls online, while his uncle Rico was still trying to relive his glory days as a high school football star. But Napoleon had a secret, a dark secret that he kept hidden from everyone else. He had a taste for murder. It started small, with a bully at school who had been tormenting him for weeks. Napoleon lured the bully into the school bathroom and locked the door behind them. Napoleon had had enough of Brock Zen's taunts and jabs. He had planned it all out carefully, waiting until the school was empty and the halls were silent. He lured Brock into the bathroom with promises of a truce, then locked the door behind them. Brock, a big and beefy guy who had tormented Napoleon for weeks, looked confused and scared as he realized what was happening.
What the heck, Dynamite?
He growled.
What are you doing?
Napoleon felt a rush of adrenaline as he pulled out the weapon he had hidden in his backpack. It was a plastic spoon, sharpened to a point, but to Napoleon, it felt like a deadly weapon.
I'm sorry it has to end like this,
he said, trying to sound menacing. Brock looked at the spoon and started to laugh.
What are you gonna do, tickle me to death?
He sneered. Napoleon's heart raced as he lunged at the bully with the spoon. But Brock was quick, and he managed to grab Napoleon's wrist and twist it, causing the spoon to fly out of his hand and clatter to the floor. Napoleon stumbled backwards, tripping over his own feet, and fell against the sink, hitting his head hard. For a moment, everything was still. Napoleon lay on the ground, dazed and confused, while Brock stood over him, panting and angry.
You're a freak, Dynamite.
He spat.
You'll never be anything but a freak.
And then, something strange happened. Brock's expression changed, as if he had suddenly realized something. He leaned down and whispered in Napoleon's ear.
You know what? You're right. I am a bully. And I'm sorry. I don't know what's wrong with me. I'm going to change, I swear.
Napoleon blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. But as he looked up, he saw Brock's face change again, this time into a sinister grin.
Just kidding, loser.
He said, and kicked Napoleon hard in the stomach. Napoleon doubled over in pain, and the next thing he knew, the bully was gone. When Napoleon finally got up, he felt a strange mix of disappointment and relief. He had failed at his first attempt at murder, but at least the bully was gone. And as he looked down at the spoon on the floor, he couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. Napoleon had become obsessed with the idea of getting rid of all the people who annoyed him. He had made a list of names and had been planning his revenge for weeks. His latest target was a girl in his class named Stacy, who had teased him about his acne and his love of Liger memes. He had followed Stacy home from school, hiding behind bushes and keeping a safe distance. He watched her go inside her house, and then he made his move. He sneaked around the side of the house and climbed up to her window. He had brought his plastic spoon with him, determined to make it work this time. As he peered inside the window, he saw Stacy sitting at her desk, typing away on her computer. She looked so oblivious, so smug, and Napoleon felt a surge of anger. This was it, he thought. He was finally going to do it. He raised his spoon and tapped on the window, trying to make a menacing sound. But the sound was more like a weak, tentative tap, and Stacy didn't even notice. Napoleon tried again, this time a little louder, but he only succeeded in making a scratch on the glass. He started to panic. What if he couldn't break the window? What if he got caught? He felt a bead of sweat run down his forehead, and he wiped it away with his sleeve. Suddenly, the window opened, and Stacy looked out, frowning.
What the heck, Napoleon? What are you doing here?
She said, her voice tinged with annoyance. Napoleon froze. He hadn't expected her to open the window. He had no plan for what to say next. He stammered. Stacy rolled her eyes.
Talk to me about what?
She said, crossing her arms. Napoleon's mind went blank. He couldn't remember why he had come here in the first place.
Your computer. I wanted to see your computer.
He blurted out. Stacy looked at him like he was crazy.
You wanted to see my computer?
She said, incredulous. Napoleon nodded, feeling more awkward by the second.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you if you have any Liger memes.
Stacy looked at him for a long moment, and then she burst out laughing.
You're such a weirdo, Napoleon,
she said, shaking her head.
But I guess you can come in and see my memes. Just don't break anything.
Napoleon felt a wave of relief wash over him. He had completely bumbled his attempt at murder, but at least he had avoided getting caught. As he climbed through the window, he couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, he and Stacy could become friends. Over the next few weeks, Napoleon continued his attempted killing spree in secret. He targeted people who had wronged him or made fun of him, people who he felt deserved to die. Each time, he carefully plotted new ways to make it look like an accident or a suicide. He was careful, meticulous, and above all, completely ruthless. First, he simmered with jealousy of Deb because of the unexpected success of her online business. He decided he would murder her so that he could take over her business. He took great pains, and nearly sweated to death, digging a hole next to the road, way out in the middle of nowhere. Even further out in the middle of nowhere than he usually always went. He dug the hole, covered it with branches, and then returned to town to invite Deb for a walk. She wondered why he was so disgustingly dirty, but nothing was particularly surprising with Napoleon, so she simply disregarded his stench and accepted his offer for the walk. As the hole he knew was there loomed just ahead, his heart began to race. The excitement pulsed through his veins. Unfortunately, when he lunged to push Deb into the hole, he missed her and instead, he plummeted into the hole.
Gosh!
Napoleon shrieked as he fell. Deb was very kind and compassionate as she helped him out of the hole, and he basically forgave her for her untimely success and decided he would start work on a portrait of her that evening. Days later, Napoleon became plagued with the idea that his best bud Pedro was staging a secret coup to overthrow his hard-earned position as class president. Obviously, Pedro had to die. Napoleon carefully rigged up what he would have thought would be a foolproof booby trap consisting of live wires and a mop bucket of water in the backstage area at school. Unfortunately, it wasn't completely foolproof, as Napoleon managed to electrocute himself instead of Pedro. In fact, it was a darn good thing Pedro was there to save him, or he might have ended up with more problems than just an arm that was numb for 6 hours. About a week later, Napoleon began to notice Rex Kwon Do was using some new martial arts moves that looked pretty familiar. They were his moves. He was certain that the outspoken martial arts master was ripping off his own signature moves, and he couldn't stand for it. He borrowed his Uncle Rico's rifle and posted up on top of the Piggly Wiggly across the street from the dojo, planning to take the cocky jerk out as soon as he came out the front door in his ridiculous American flag pants. Hadn't Rex ever heard of a little thing called a flag violation? Just another reason the idiot had to die. Napoleon's chance came soon enough and he took the shot. Unfortunately, instead of making it to his intended target, the bullet was intercepted by the fat lard of a turkey ambling across the dusty road. The turkey died, but not before running around insanely, shrieking and flapping. It caused a car to veer off the road and run into a bank of shopping carts with a deafening crunch. Napoleon slid backwards and Army crawled off the roof, leaving behind Uncle Rico's rifle in his hope to get away undetected. Speaking of Uncle Rico, Napoleon finally had enough of listening to him talk about his football exploits and eating all the good steak. He was growing more confident in his murder skills, and decided to concoct a sandwich of delicious ham and an assortment of household cleaners. Unfortunately, when he presented the sandwich to Uncle Rico, he simply laughed and chucked the sandwich to the llama, Tina. Napoleon's heart leapt into his throat as he watched the beloved family pet happily lap up every bite of the sandwich. He didn't want her to eat it, but what could he do without revealing his secret? She honked and hawed as she finished it, and Napoleon tried not to cry. It was a tense few days after that, watching Tina, expecting her to drop dead at any moment. After a week, she was still alive and he decided she would hopefully live. He vowed never to body shame her again after that incident. After another week, Napoleon was getting ready to attempt another murder. He was plotting out a plan to kill his brother Kip, when he heard a knock on the door. Peeking through the peephole, he saw 2 police officers standing on his porch. His heart skipped a beat. He began to sweat profusely. Had they figured out what he was up to? He nervously opened the door, trying to appear casual.
Hi, officers. What brings you here?
He asked. The first officer spoke up.
We're looking for a suspect in a string of petty thefts in the area. We've received reports of some suspicious activity around this house, so we just wanted to ask you a few questions.
Napoleon blinked repeatedly and shoved his wire glasses up his sweaty nose.
I don't even have any good skills. You know, like nunchuck skills, bow hunting skills, computer hacking skills.
The officers exchanged a glance and then frowned at Napoleon.
Son, we're not accusing you of anything. We'd simply like to have a look around if you don't mind.
Somewhere inside his mind, alarm bells began to go off. He was worried they'd find his nunchucks and become suspicious. If they weren't already. But like an idiot, he simply stepped aside and let them in. The officers began to search the house, while Napoleon tried to keep his cool. But huge pit stains developed under his armpits, and now his nose had begun to run in addition to the sweat that had caused his curls to stick to his forehead. He couldn't let them find any evidence of his murder attempts. Soon, the officers were about to leave. The first officer turned to Napoleon.
Listen, son. I know this might be tough for you, but if you know anything about these thefts, it's important that you come forward. We're here to help you, not to accuse you of anything.
Napoleon felt a pang of guilt. He almost blurted out everything he had done, but he managed to stop himself just in time.
Thanks, officers. I'll keep that in mind.
The officers left, and Napoleon let out a sigh of relief. He realized how lucky he had been. Although he knew he was an impeccable attempted murderer, who made practically perfect plans, he realized he could have ended up in serious trouble if the police had caught wind of what he was doing. From that day on, Napoleon decided to give up his murderous ways and focus on something more positive, like spending more time with Tina or perfecting his dance moves. He still wished he could murder every idiot he came across, but at the end of the day, he just didn't like the pressure. Didn't care for the heat. It wasn't exactly the outcome he had hoped for, but at least he could sleep soundly knowing that he wasn't going to prison for attempted murder.
Twyla had never been so scared in her life. She was lost on the prairie, with no food, water, or shelter. The sun had set long ago, and the only light came from the moon and stars. She hugged herself, trying to keep warm, but the wind was biting cold. She had been out here for hours, maybe even days, she had lost count. Twyla was a young girl of 16, living in a small settlement on the prairie. Her family were farmers, and they had a small cabin on the outskirts of the settlement. One day, while out gathering berries, she had wandered too far from home and got lost. She had tried to retrace her steps, but the prairie all looked the same, and she had only ended up getting more lost. While she wandered, Twyla started to hear strange noises. They were coming from all around her, and she couldn't tell what they were. It sounded like whispering, or maybe even laughter. She shuddered, feeling a chill run down her spine. Suddenly, she saw a light in the distance. It was flickering, like a candle flame. She couldn't believe her luck. Maybe it was someone from the settlement who had come out to look for her. She started to run towards the light, hoping to find help. Twyla ventured closer. She saw that the light was coming from a small cabin. It looked old and abandoned, but there was smoke coming from the chimney. Twyla hesitated for a moment, but the cold and the darkness were too much for her. She decided to take a chance and knock on the door. She rapped on the door with her knuckles. There was no answer. She tried again, harder this time. Still no answer. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The inside of the cabin was dimly lit by a single candle. The walls were bare, and there was no furniture, except for a rocking chair in the corner. Twyla felt a sense of unease, but she tried to push it aside. She needed to warm up and rest. Twyla walked further into the cabin. She saw something that made her heart skip a beat. There was a figure sitting in the rocking chair. It was an old woman, with wrinkled skin and gray hair. She was staring straight ahead, not moving at all. Twyla felt a sense of dread wash over her. Was the woman dead?
Hello?
Twyla called out tentatively.
Are you okay?
The woman didn't respond. Twyla took a few steps closer, trying to get a better look at her. Suddenly, the woman's eyes snapped open. They were completely black, with no pupils or whites. Twyla screamed and stumbled backwards, falling onto the floor. The woman cackled, a high-pitched, unnatural sound.
Welcome, child,
she said.
I've been waiting for you.
Twyla scrambled to her feet and backed towards the door. She had to get out of here. She had to find her way back home. But the woman stood up, and Twyla froze. She towered over her, her face twisted into a cruel smile.
You can't leave yet,
she said.
You have to play my game first.
Twyla had no idea what the woman was talking about, but she knew she had to get away. She bolted towards the door, but the woman caught her by the arm, her grip like iron.
Let me go!
Twyla screamed. The woman pulled her back, and Twyla felt something cold and sharp press against her neck. Twyla's heart raced as she felt the cold metal of the knife against her skin. She could feel the woman's breath on her neck, and her grip tightened. Twyla knew she had to act fast. She twisted her body and kicked out with her foot, catching the woman in the stomach. The woman stumbled backwards, dropping the knife. Twyla didn't hesitate. She ran towards the door and burst outside, gasping for air. But the night was still dark, and Twyla was lost once again. She could hear the woman's cackling laughter behind her, and she knew she had to keep moving. She ran as fast as she could, stumbling over rocks and roots. As she ran, she started to see more lights in the distance. They were flickering and dancing, like fireflies. Twyla had never seen anything like it before. She was drawn to them, almost hypnotized. She followed the lights, moving deeper into the prairie. Twyla got closer, and she saw that the lights were coming from a group of people. They were dancing and singing, their faces painted with strange symbols. Twyla hesitated, but something inside her told her to keep going. She stepped closer, and the people turned to look at her. They were all women, dressed in long flowing robes. Their eyes were dark, and they had an otherworldly look about them.
"Welcome, child,"
one of them said, beckoning her closer.
"Join us."
Twyla felt a chill run down her spine. There was something off about these women. But she couldn't turn back now. She stepped closer, and the women started to dance around her. Their movements were wild and uncontrolled, like they were possessed. The women danced. Twyla felt something inside her start to shift. It was like a fog had lifted from her mind, and she could see things more clearly. She saw the women's faces change, their eyes turn black. She saw the way they moved, like they were being controlled by something else. She tried to run, but the women were too fast. They caught her and dragged her to the ground. Twyla screamed, but no one could hear her. She was alone, lost in the prairie. The women started to chant, their voices rising in a strange language. Twyla couldn't understand what they were saying, but she knew it was something dark and evil. She felt a hand on her forehead, and a wave of coldness washed over her. She woke up hours later, alone and cold. She had no idea how long she had been unconscious, or where she was. She stumbled to her feet and looked around. She was in a clearing, surrounded by trees. She could see the moonlight filtering through the leaves. As she walked, she saw something in the distance. It was a small cottage, with smoke coming from the chimney. Twyla hesitated for a moment, but she knew she had to take a chance. She walked towards the cottage, hoping to find help. As she got closer, she saw that the door was open. She pushed it open and stepped inside. The cottage was warm and cozy, with a fire burning in the hearth. Twyla felt a sense of relief wash over her. She had found shelter, at least for now. But as she looked around, she saw something that made her blood run cold. There was a woman sitting in the corner, with her back to Twyla. She had long black hair, and she was wearing a long white dress. Twyla could feel a sense of unease radiating from her.
"Hello?"
Twyla called out tentatively. The woman turned slowly to face Twyla, revealing a face that was pale and gaunt. Her eyes were black, and her mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile. Twyla felt a shiver run down her spine as she looked at her.
"Welcome, child,"
the woman said in a soft voice.
"I've been expecting you."
Twyla took a step back, feeling the hairs on the back of her neck stand up.
"Who are you?"
she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The woman stood up and walked towards her, her eyes fixed on Twyla's.
"I am Lilith,"
she said, her voice barely above a whisper.
"And you are mine now."
Twyla tried to run, but Lilith was too fast. She grabbed Twyla by the arm and dragged her towards the fire. Twyla could feel the heat of the flames against her skin, and she struggled to break free. But Lilith was too strong. She pushed Twyla towards the flames, and Twyla felt a searing pain as her skin touched the fire. She screamed, but Lilith didn't stop.
You belong to me now.
Lilith hissed, her eyes burning with an otherworldly light.
You will serve me for all eternity.
Twyla felt herself slipping away, the pain and fear overwhelming her. But then she heard a voice, a familiar voice.
Twyla, wake up.
It was her mother's voice. Twyla opened her eyes and found herself back in her bed, in her own time. She was drenched in sweat, her heart racing.
It was just a dream,
her mother said, stroking her hair.
You're safe now.
Twyla looked up at her mother, feeling a sense of relief wash over her. It had all been a nightmare. But then she noticed something strange. Her mother's face was different. Her eyes were black, and her mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile. Twyla screamed, and the nightmare began all over again.
There was a small town named Willow Creek, located in the middle of nowhere. It was an isolated place surrounded by dense forests and mountains, where the townsfolk led a simple life. The town had a history of strange happenings and paranormal occurrences that the locals believed to be the work of vengeful spirits. There was one particular ghost that the town feared the most. Her name was Tilly, and she was a young woman who had been accused of witchcraft and burned at the stake over 200 years ago. Her ghost was said to haunt the woods around the town, seeking revenge on those who had accused her of witchcraft. Tilly's ghostly figure was a sight that no one who had seen it could ever forget. Her skin looked charred as though there was a fire burning beneath it, and her eyes were a deep, dark void that seemed to suck in all the light around them. Her hair was long and tangled, and it looked as though it was made of black smoke that was constantly swirling around her head. But perhaps the most eerie aspect of Tilly's appearance was the way she held her hands behind her back at all times, as though she was hiding something. And her face was always contorted in a pained expression, as though she was constantly reliving the agony of her execution. Despite her terrifying appearance, there was also a sadness about Tilly that was palpable. Her ghostly figure exuded a sense of longing and desperation, as though she was searching for something that she could never find. Many of the townsfolk had reported seeing Tilly wandering the woods at night, and some had even claimed to have heard her whispering to them. But no one dared to approach her, as her ghostly figure was enough to strike fear into the bravest of hearts. One summer, a group of teenagers decided to camp in the woods near Willow Creek. They had heard about the legend of Tilly's ghost and wanted to see if it was true. As they set up camp, they heard strange noises coming from the woods. They dismissed it as just the wind and continued to set up camp. As the night grew darker, they started to feel uneasy. They heard footsteps around their campsite and saw shadows moving in the darkness. Suddenly, they saw a figure emerging from the woods. It was Tilly's ghost, and she was coming straight for them. The teenagers ran for their lives, but Tilly's ghost was too fast. She chased them through the woods, and they could feel her icy breath on their necks. They could hear her laughter echoing through the woods, and they knew that they were in grave danger. Finally, they stumbled upon an old abandoned house, and they thought they could hide there. But Tilly's ghost was right behind them, and they knew that they were trapped. They could hear her banging on the doors and windows, trying to get in. Suddenly, one of the teenagers remembered a legend that said that Tilly's ghost could be appeased by an offering of food. They quickly gathered some food from their backpacks and placed it outside the door. To their surprise, the banging stopped and the laughter died down. The teenagers thought that they had escaped Tilly's ghost, but they were wrong. When they woke up the next morning, they found that they were no longer in the abandoned house. They were back in their campsite, with no memory of how they had gotten there. As they packed up their campsite and prepared to leave, they saw a shadowy figure watching them from the woods. It was Tilly's ghost, and she had not been appeased by their offering. After the terrifying encounter with Tilly's ghost, the surviving teenagers could not shake off the feeling of dread that lingered with them. They were desperate to know more about Tilly's backstory and why she had become a vengeful spirit. They went to the town's library and found an old dusty book that detailed the history of Willow Creek. According to the book, Tilly was a young woman who had been accused of witchcraft and burned at the stake over 200 years ago. Her accusers had claimed that she had cursed the town, and that she had made a pact with the devil. The book also explained why people believed that food appeased her. It was said that Tilly had always been a kind-hearted woman who had helped the townsfolk during times of need. Before her execution, she had begged the townsfolk to offer food to the poor in her memory. It was believed that Tilly's ghost still roamed the woods, seeking to fulfill her wish by accepting food offerings. The surviving teenagers were fascinated by Tilly's tragic story, and they wanted to know more. They decided to explore the woods and see if they could find any clues that would shed light on her mysterious death. As they walked deeper into the woods, they stumbled upon the same old abandoned cabin, but there was a strange aura around it that made them feel uneasy. They cautiously approached the cabin and noticed that there was a book lying on the doorstep. The book was an old diary that belonged to Tilly. They eagerly opened the book and started to read. The diary contained a detailed account of Tilly's life, her love for a young man named Daniel, and how her life had taken a turn for the worse when she had been accused of witchcraft. They learned that Tilly had not made a pact with the devil, but that she had been falsely accused by jealous townsfolk who were envious of her beauty and her relationship with Daniel. They also learned that Tilly had been pregnant with Daniel's child when she had been burned at the stake. The surviving teenagers were horrified by the injustice that had been done to Tilly. They vowed to do everything in their power to ensure that her story was told, and that justice was served. They went back to the town and organized a memorial service for Tilly. They invited the townsfolk, and they shared Tilly's tragic story with them. They also shared the food offerings that they had brought as a tribute to Tilly. As they sat in the memorial service, they felt a strange presence around them. They turned around, and to their amazement, they saw Tilly's ghost standing in the doorway. But this time, she looked at peace, and she smiled at them. The surviving teenagers knew that Tilly's ghost had finally found peace, and that justice had been served. They felt a sense of closure, and they knew that they could finally move on from the horrors that they had encountered in the woods. From that day on, the townsfolk of Willow Creek remembered Tilly as a kind-hearted woman who had been wronged by a town consumed by fear and jealousy. And her legacy lived on, as the town started to offer food to the poor in her memory, as she had wished so long ago.